Sherlock Holmes and the Yeti in the Cellar, a cozy snowbound mystery at 221B Baker Street. Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the evening where stories unfold like gentle mist across a winter garden. Tonight, we journey together to Victorian London, to a time of gaslight and mystery, where snow falls softly against window panes and the world moves at a pace that allows the mind to rest. This story is crafted for those moments when thoughts whirl too quickly, when sleep feels distant, and when what you need most is simply to slow down, to breathe, to let go. As you listen, there is nothing you must do, nowhere you must be. Simply allow the words to wash over you like warm water, carrying you toward peaceful rest. Before we begin, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? What corner of this wide world has brought you here? Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had been falling over London for 3 days without ceasing, a persistent whisper against the windows of 221B Baker Street that had become as familiar as one's own heartbeat. It was the sort of rain that did not announce itself with thunder or dramatic flourish, but rather settled into the bones of the city like an old friend taking residence, patient and eternal. Inside the sitting room, the fire in the hearth crackled with a voice all its own, speaking in pops and sighs as the flames danced their amber waltz across seasoned logs that Mrs. Hudson had brought up earlier that afternoon. The scent of burning oak mingled with the faint perfume of pipe tobacco, creating an atmosphere so distinctly of that place and time that one could close their eyes and know without question that this was Baker Street, that this was home. Sherlock Holmes sat in his customary chair, the one positioned to catch both the warmth of the fire and the wan light that filtered through the rain streaked windows. He had been sitting thus for the better part of an hour, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes focused on some invisible point in the middle distance, where, Dr. Watson knew from long experience, entire worlds of deduction and reasoning played out in intricate detail. Watson himself occupied the chair opposite, a medical journal resting forgotten in his lap, his attention drawn instead to the simple pleasure of watching the rain trace silver paths down the glass, each droplet catching and reflecting the firelight in miniature constellations. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with reassuring regularity, measuring out the seconds in soft metallic whispers that seemed to slow time itself, transforming the dreary December afternoon into something suspended, peaceful, eternal. Outside, the city continued its muffled commerce, the sounds of carriage wheels and distant voices softened by the rain into a gentle symphony of urban life at rest. A hansom cab passed below, its horse's hooves creating a rhythmic clop, clop, clop that faded gradually into the general murmur of the weather-wrapped streets. And so they sat, two friends in comfortable silence, while the rain continued its patient work, and the fire whispered secrets to the shadows that gathered in the corners of the room. The afternoon deepened into early evening, that peculiar winter twilight when the boundary between day and night becomes pleasantly uncertain, and still the rain fell, and still the fire burned, and still the world outside seemed very far away indeed. It was perhaps 5:30 when the sound came, so subtle at first that Watson wondered if he had imagined it. A soft scraping, like fingernails on wood, emanating from somewhere below their feet. Holmes's eyes, which had been half closed in contemplation, opened fully, and Watson saw in them that particular spark of interest that presaged adventure. "Did you hear?" Watson began, but Holmes raised a single finger, requesting silence. They listened together, barely breathing, and there it came again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. A methodical sound, purposeful yet strangely tentative, coming distinctly from the direction of the cellar. Mrs. Hudson kept the cellar locked, Watson knew, using it primarily for storage of coal and various household necessities. The sound was not that of settling wood, or the ordinary complaints of an old building. It possessed an organic quality, something living and deliberate. Holmes rose from his chair with that peculiar grace he possessed, moving silently across the Persian carpet toward the doorway. Watson followed, his medical training lending him a certain steadiness, even as his pulse quickened with anticipation. Together, they descended the stairs, each step producing the softest creak in the old wood, until they reached the ground floor, where Mrs. Hudson's domain spread out in cozy domesticity. The hallway, with its coat stand, the small table where the post was placed, the reassuring smell of bread baking for tomorrow's breakfast. The door to the cellar stood at the far end of the hall, a heavy oak affair with iron hinges that had guarded the depths below for more than a century. As they approached, the scraping sound grew more distinct, and with it came something else. A low, resonant breathing, deep and rhythmic, like the respiration of something very large or very ancient. Holmes produced a key. Watson had long since ceased to wonder how his friend came by keys to every lock in their lodgings, and turned it slowly in the mechanism. The lock disengaged with a soft click that seemed thunderous in the hushed atmosphere. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a darkness that flickered into uncertain visibility as Holmes lifted the oil lamp from its hook beside the doorway. The flame steadied, casting a golden circle of light that pushed back the shadows to reveal the stone steps leading down into the cellar's depths. The air that rose from below was cool and carried with it a scent that Watson could not immediately place, something mineral and old, like caves or deep earth, but beneath it something else, something almost spicy, reminiscent of distant mountains and snow. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured, and began his descent. The cellar of 221B Baker Street was larger than one might expect, its stone walls dating back to a time when this part of London had been something altogether different, when the street itself had been a country lane, and the buildings had been few and far between. The ceiling was vaulted, disappearing into darkness above the lamp's reach, and the space had been divided by Mrs. Hudson into various sections. Coal storage here, preserved foods there, trunks of belongings that had accumulated over the years in that mysterious way that such things do in old houses. But it was to the far corner that Holmes directed their attention, where the shadows seemed to gather most thickly, where the stone walls met at an angle that suggested greater depth than the house above could account for. As they approached, the breathing sound grew more pronounced, and Watson found himself gripping the lamp more tightly, though whether from nervousness or anticipation, he could not say. "There," Holmes whispered, pointing. In the corner, barely visible in the lamplight, something massive stirred. White fur, thick and shaggy, caught the light and seemed to glow with its own luminescence. The creature, for creature it undeniably was, sat hunched against the wall, its enormous frame folded into a posture that suggested both patience and profound weariness. As the light fell more fully upon it, Watson saw features that belonged in mountain legends and travelers' tales. A broad, intelligent face, covered in white fur, deep-set eyes that reflected the lamplight with an almost human sadness, massive hands that ended in curved claws, currently engaged in the methodical scratching they had heard from above. Not aggressive, but rather purposeful, tracing patterns in the ancient stone. The creature regarded them with those luminous eyes, and Watson felt his breath catch, not with fear, but with wonder. For in that gaze he recognized something profound and unexpected. Intelligence, certainly, but also something deeper, a melancholy awareness that spoke of displacement and longing. Before you fall asleep, write in the comments what time it is for you, and where you are from. Holmes stood very still, the lamp steady in his hand, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the triumph of discovery, but rather a gentle curiosity, almost reverent. You have travelled very far, I think, and not by choice. The creature made no sound in response, but its eyes moved from Holmes to Watson and back again, and in that movement was a story waiting to be told, a mystery that would unfold in the quiet hours of this snowbound evening, drawing them deeper into questions of how and why, of ancient legends made flesh, of the impossible rendered simply, beautifully real in a cellar beneath Baker Street, while the rain continued its endless song against the windows far above. The silence that followed Holmes's words stretched like spun glass, delicate and shimmering, filled with the sound of three beings breathing in the lamplit darkness of the cellar. Watson found himself acutely aware of the texture of that moment, the coolet moment, the coolness of the stone walls radiating a chill that had nothing to do with winter, the weight of the lamp in his hand growing heavier by slow degrees, the way shadows pooled in the vaulted spaces above them, like dark water gathering in forgotten wells. The creature before them remained motionless, though Watson sensed a quality of listening in its stillness, as though it were waiting for something, some signal or word that would unlock the mystery of its presence here, beneath the familiar rooms where they took their tea and solved the puzzles that London brought to their door. Holmes moved forward with extraordinary care, each footfall placed with the deliberation of a man crossing ice of uncertain thickness. Watson had seen his friend approach dangerous criminals, had watched him handle volatile chemicals, and diffuse situations of considerable peril, but never with quite this quality of reverence. It was as though Holmes understood, in that uncanny way he had of perceiving truths invisible to others, that what sat before them was not a threat to be neutralized, but rather a guest who had arrived through circumstances beyond imagining, deserving of courtesy and gentle handling. "Watson," Holmes said softly, without turning, "I believe we shall need Mrs. Hudson's assistance. Would you be so kind as to ask her to prepare the sitting-room fire to maximum warmth, and perhaps to bring hot water, blankets, and whatever foodstuffs might be appropriate for—" He paused, considering, for one who has journeyed from very high and very cold places. Watson hesitated, reluctant to leave his friend alone with the creature, but the steady confidence in Holmes's voice and the clear intelligence in the creature's eyes persuaded him that no danger lurked here, only mystery and perhaps profound sadness. He climbed the cellar stairs with the lamp, leaving Holmes in near darkness with their unexpected visitor, and went to find Mrs. Hudson, his mind already formulating how one might explain the situation without causing alarm. Below, in the darkness, now illuminated only by the faint light filtering down from the hallway above. Holmes lowered himself to sit upon the cold stone floor, his posture deliberately unthreatening, open. He could hear the creature's breathing more clearly now, a deep rhythm that spoke of lung capacity far exceeding human measure, and beneath it something else, a faint whistling quality that suggested altitude adaptation, the biological modifications that allowed life in thin mountain air where humans struggled even to think clearly. "The scratching we heard," Holmes said conversationally, his voice barely above a murmur, "was not random, was it? You were making marks, patterns. May I see?" The creature shifted slightly, moving one massive hand away from the wall where it had been working. Holmes rose and approached, running his fingers over the stone surface. Even in the dim light, he could feel what had been inscribed there. Symbols, definitely, carved with remarkable precision, given the crude tool of claw against stone. They were not random scratches, but rather pictographs of a sort, stylized representations that Holmes's trained eye recognized as having structure, grammar, meaning. A mountain, rendered in simple lines, a cave entrance, what might be human figures, smaller than the figure that surely represented the creature itself, and then a sequence that Holmes could not immediately interpret, something that might be stars, or snow, or both, arranged in patterns that suggested either constellation or sacred meaning. "You are telling me how you came to be here," Holmes said, wonder creeping into his usually controlled voice. "You are explaining, in the only way available to you, that something happened. Something brought you from your home to ours." A sound emerged from the creature then, low and resonant, vibrating through the stone floor and up through Holmes's bones. It was not threatening, but rather seemed almost affirmative, a response that carried emotional weight without conventional language. Holmes felt the hair on his arms rise, not with fear, but with the profound recognition of standing before something that expanded the boundaries of what he had believed possible in this catalogued, measured world. Above them, footsteps sounded, Watson returning, and with him the bustling energy of Mrs. Hudson, who could be heard exclaiming in her practical way about the draughts and the cold, and really, Mr. Holmes, what could be so important in the cellar at this hour? Then she appeared at the top of the stairs, lamp in hand, and her exclamations ceased abruptly as the light fell upon the scene below. To her eternal credit, Mrs. Hudson did not scream, did not drop her lamp, did not flee. She stood very still for a long moment, taking in the sight of the enormous white-furred creature hunched in her cellar, and Sherlock Holmes sitting companionably beside it on the cold stone floor. Then she said, in a voice only slightly strained, "I shall need to bring down more blankets than I thought. And the soup. There is soup from dinner, a good mutton soup. Will that do you think, Mr. Holmes?" "Admirably, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes replied with genuine warmth. "You are, as always, a wonder of adaptability and grace." The process of coaxing their visitor up the narrow cellar stairs proved less difficult than anticipated. The creature moved with surprising agility despite its size, ascending with a bent-over gait that allowed it to navigate the low ceiling, and emerged into the hallway like some figure from ancient legend, stepping across the threshold between worlds. In the better light, Watson could see more clearly the remarkable nature of their guest. Fur of purest white, thick enough to withstand extremes of cold that would kill a human in minutes. Eyes that reflected light with a golden amber quality. and features that occupied some space between ape and human, suggesting evolutionary paths diverged long ago, or perhaps never diverged at all, but rather ran parallel in isolated places where the map still held mysteries. They guided it, for both men had independently formed the conviction that it failed to capture the personhood evident in those intelligent eyes, up to the sitting room, where Mrs. Hudson had indeed built up the fire until it roared with almost uncomfortable intensity. The creature moved immediately toward the warmth, settling with a long, satisfied exhalation that misted in the air despite the room's heat, suggesting an internal temperature regulation suited for environments where exposed skin meant death. Watson found himself performing the physician's examination by instinct, observing respiration rate, checking for signs of distress or injury. The creature bore what appeared to be old wounds on one shoulder, scars beneath the white fur that spoke of some past violence, but nothing that required immediate intervention. It accepted their ministrations with patient tolerance, occasionally making that low, resonant sound that they were beginning to recognize as a form of communication, nuanced in ways that spoken language might struggle to match. Mrs. Hudson arrived with the soup, carried in the large tureen normally reserved for dinner parties, along with what appeared to be an entire loaf of bread and a substantial wedge of cheese. She set the food down without ceremony, and the creature reached for it with surprising delicacy, handling the tureen with careful precision, despite hands that could surely crush it like paper. It ate slowly, methodically, and with what Watson could only describe as good manners, taking time between mouthfuls, chewing thoroughly, exhibiting none of the savage desperation one might expect from a lost creature far from home. Holmes had settled into his chair, his eyes never leaving their guest, his mind clearly working through the implications and possibilities. "Watson," he said at length, "you will recall the accounts in recent months of unusual disturbances in the British Museum's natural history collection. Items moved, yet nothing stolen. Security guards reporting sounds in the night, a sense of presence, but never catching sight of any intruder." "Yes," Watson confirmed. Inspector Gregson mentioned it in passing. He thought it was perhaps students playing pranks, or staff helping themselves to artifacts after hours. "And yet," Holmes continued, "the disturbances centered around the Himalayan collection. Artifacts from Tibet, Nepal, from the high places where legend speaks of beings that walk upright in the eternal snows. Beings called by various names: Yeti, Metokangmi, the abominable snowman, though I have always found that last appellation rather unjust, implying moral judgment where none is warranted." The creature had finished eating, and now sat with the empty tureen held gently in its massive hands, looking between Holmes and Watson with an expression that might have been hope, or perhaps simply attention. Outside, the rain had intensified, driven now by wind that made the windows rattle softly in their frames, a sound like gentle percussion accompanying the fire's steady crackle. "You went to the museum," Holmes said, addressing the creature directly, his tone gentle as one might use with a frightened child. "You went seeking something, did you not? Something familiar, something of home. The artifacts, the things brought back by explorers and collectors, they carried the scent of your mountains, the trace of places you knew." Another of those resonant sounds, this one carrying such clear tones of affirmation and longing that Watson felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Here was displacement beyond measure, a being torn from everything familiar, seeking connection with mere objects because they were all that remained of a world now impossibly distant. The rain whispered against the windows. The fire spoke in its ancient tongue of comfort and warmth. And in the sitting room of 221B Baker Street, 3 beings sat together in the lamplight, the boundaries between possible and impossible blurring like watercolours left too long in the rain, running together into something new and strange and deeply, quietly peaceful. Morning arrived with unexpected gentleness, the rain having ceased sometime in the small hours, while the occupants of 221B Baker Street had kept their vigil by the fire. Watson had dozed in his chair, wrapped in one of Mrs. Hudson's quilts, Wakingson's quilts, waking periodically to find Holmes still alert, still watching, still engaged in that peculiar silent communion he seemed to have established with their extraordinary guest. The creature itself had eventually settled near the hearth, curled into a position that brought to mind nothing so much as a massive cat seeking warmth, its breathing deep and even, suggesting sleep or something very like it. Now, with pale winter sunlight filtering through the curtains in thin golden streams, the sitting room had taken on an almost dreamlike quality, as though the events of the previous evening belonged to some other realm entirely, some story told rather than lived. And yet there it remained, undeniably present, its white fur gilded by the morning light, one great hand tucked beneath its chin, in a gesture so inherently human that Watson found himself smiling despite the strangeness of it all. Holmes rose from his chair, moving with the stiffness of a man who had maintained one position too long, and crossed to the window. He drew back the curtain fully, allowing the morning to flood the room with its clear, cold illumination. The street below glistened with residual moisture, puddles reflecting the sky like scattered mirrors. And already London was stirring. The rattle of milk carts, the call of vendors, the perpetual motion of a city that never quite slept, merely rested its eyes for brief intervals before resuming its ancient dance. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, careful not to disturb their sleeping guest, "I believe it would be prudent to make inquiries at the British Museum this morning. There are questions that require answers, patterns that need illumination. Will you accompany me, or would you prefer to remain here?" Watson stood, folding the quilt with automatic precision, born of military training. "I shall come with you, naturally, though perhaps we should wait until our friend awakens. It seems discourteous to depart without—" He paused, unsure how to complete the thought. Without what? Without saying goodbye, without explaining where they were going. The social conventions that governed human interaction seemed suddenly inadequate, but Holmes was nodding thoughtfully. "Mrs. Hudson will be here, and I believe our visitor understands more than we might initially assume. Communication, Watson, takes forms beyond mere words. The symbols carved in the cellar stone, the way it responds to tone and gesture. There is language here, simply one we are only beginning to learn." They prepared for their excursion in the companionable silence of old friends, donning coats and scarves against the December cold, Holmes selecting his second-best hat, the first being reserved for occasions of particular formality, and Watson ensuring his medical bag accompanied them, though for what purpose he could not quite articulate. Simply feeling its presence might prove necessary. Before departing, Holmes penned a brief note and left it prominently displayed on the mantelpiece. "We have gone to investigate. Will return by noon. You are safe here. SH. The creature stirred as they moved toward the door, raising its great head to regard them with those luminous eyes. Holmes met that gaze steadily, then performed a slight bow, formal and respectful, before gesturing to the note and then to the door, attempting to convey through pantomime what words could not. The creature made its low resonant sound. Acknowledgement, Watson thought, or perhaps blessing, and settled back into its rest. The journey to the British Museum took them through streets still waking, past shops raising their shutters, and restaurants where the first pots of coffee sent aromatic signals into the crisp air. Holmes walked with his characteristic swift pace, his mind clearly engaged with the puzzle before them, occasionally muttering observations that Watson had learned not to interrupt. The timing is significant. Arrived in London no more than 3 weeks ago, judging by the museum disturbances. But the journey itself, the mechanism of arrival, that remains the central question. One does not simply transport a creature of such size across continents without considerable planning, or without leaving traces. They arrived at the museum as it opened its great doors to admit the first visitors of the day. Scholars, mostly at this hour. Serious men with notebooks and specific research purposes, moving through the grand entrance hall with the purposeful air of those who knew exactly which gallery held the object of their interest. Holmes led Watson directly to the administrative offices, where he requested an audience with Dr. Bartholomew Sutcliffe, the curator responsible for the Himalayan and Central Asian collections. Dr. Sutcliffe proved to be a man in his 60s, with the weathered complexion of someone who had spent considerable time at altitude, and the slightly distracted manner of one whose mind habitually occupied spaces far from his physical location. He received them in an office cluttered with artifacts, maps covering every available wall surface, and tottering stacks of books that seemed to defy gravity through sheer determination. "Mr. Holmes," Sutcliffe said, gesturing them to chairs that required clearing of various papers and small carved statues before they could be occupied. "Your telegram this morning mentioned matters of some urgency regarding our Himalayan collection. I confess myself intrigued, though also somewhat concerned. Has there been some theft? Some damage?" Holmes settled into his chair with the precision of a man accustomed to navigating cluttered spaces. "Nothing stolen, Doctor, though there have been disturbances, have there not? Items moved, though always returned. A sense of presence in the galleries after hours. The night guards reporting sounds they could not quite identify." Sutcliffe's expression shifted from polite interest to something more guarded. "Those reports were meant to be confidential, Mr. Holmes. How did you—" He stopped himself, waving a hand dismissively. "No, never mind. Your methods are legendary. Yes, there have been incidents. Nothing we could report to the police with any specificity, you understand. Simply a feeling of visitation, as though someone, or something, was examining the collection with great care, great interest, but without any destructive intent." "Exactly so," Holmes said, leaning forward. "Dr. Sutcliffe, I must ask you about the most recent additions to your collection. Specifically, any items acquired within the last 6 months from the Himalayan region." The curator rose and moved to a large cabinet, withdrawing a leather-bound ledger that he opened with practiced ease. His finger traced down columns of entries, dates and descriptions, and acquisition sources, forming a catalogue of objects plucked from their original contexts and transported to this temple of knowledge and preservation. "We received several items in September," he said slowly, "from the Morrison expedition. They spent 18 months in Tibet and Nepal, primarily engaged in geographical survey work, but they brought back artifacts as well. Religious items mostly. Prayer wheels, Thankar paintings, ritual implements." "And was there anything unusual about these items?" Watson interjected. "Anything that might have carried passengers, so to speak?" Sutcliffe looked up sharply, his scholarly face creasing with confusion, and perhaps the first stirring of alarm. "Passengers, Dr. Watson, I am not certain I understand your meaning." At that moment, a young assistant appeared in the doorway, breathless and clearly agitated, clutching a piece of paper that trembled in his hand. "Dr. Sutcliffe, sir, I beg your pardon for the interruption, but there has been another incident. Last night, after the museum closed, the night watchman, Jenkins, he found something in the Himalayan gallery. Something left behind, he says. Something impossible." The shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable, like the change in air pressure before a storm. Holmes and Watson exchanged glances, and Watson saw in his friend's eyes that particular gleam that indicated pieces falling into place, patterns emerging from what had seemed chaos. They followed Sutcliffe and his assistant through the museum's corridors, past displays of Egyptian sarcophagi and Greek statuary, past cases filled with minerals and fossils, until they reached the wing devoted to Asian collections. The Himalayan gallery was a long room with high ceilings, skylights allowing natural illumination to fall upon the displayed artifacts. Prayer flags hung from the ceiling in faded colours, and along the walls were arranged objects that spoke of high mountain cultures, of peoples who lived in the thin air where earth met sky. And there, in the centre of the gallery, arranged with obvious care and intention, was something that made even Holmes pause in his stride. A mandala, created not from coloured sand as traditional practice dictated, but from snow. Pure white snow, already beginning to melt in the museum's temperature, forming a perfect geometric pattern on the polished floor, intricate beyond measure, each detail rendered with precision that suggested profound knowledge and deep reverence. It was a message, Watson realized, or perhaps an offering, left by their guest during its nocturnal visits, a piece of its world brought to this place of preservation and study, a bridge between there and here, between the mountains and the museum, between legend and the undeniable reality, sleeping peacefully in the sitting room of 221B Baker Street. Dr. Sutcliffe stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his scholarly composure visibly shaken by the sight before him. The young assistant had fetched towels and was hovering uncertainly at the gallery's entrance, unclear whether to begin the practical work of cleaning or to preserve what remained of this mysterious creation. The morning light continued its steady fall through the skylights, indifferent to human concerns, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny snow themselves through the still air of the museum. The precision of it, Holmes murmured, his voice carrying that particular quality of reverence he reserved for truly exceptional observations, suggests not merely artistic inclination, but mathematical understanding of a high order. These proportions, Watson, follow principles found in Tibetan Buddhist cosmology. The representation of Mount Meru at the center, surrounded by the continents and subcontinents, the whole universe contained within a circle, but executed in snow, which itself carries symbolic weight. Impermanence, transitory nature of all phenomena, made visible through the very medium that will ensure its destruction. Watson crouched beside his friend, careful not to disturb what remained of the mandala's outer edges. Up close, he could see how each element had been placed with impossible delicacy. The snow, not simply piled, but shaped, compressed, formed into lines so fine they seemed drawn with a pen, rather than fashioned by hand. Or by claw, he corrected himself, remembering the careful precision with which their guest had held Mrs. Hudson's soup tureen. "Dr. Sutcliffe," Holmes said, rising and turning to face the curator. "You mentioned the Morrison expedition. I require every detail you can provide about their journey, but most particularly about the circumstances of their return. Did they travel by conventional routes? Were there reports of unusual cargo or companions?" Sutcliffe shook his head slowly, his weathered face creasing with the effort of recollection. Morrison was notoriously secretive about his methods. He believed other expeditions had appropriated his discoveries in the past, you see. But I can tell you this: they returned to London, not by the expected route through India and by sea, but rather overland through Russia, and then by rail across Europe. Most irregular for a scientific expedition, and the costs must have been considerable. At the time, I assumed he wished to avoid certain colonial authorities who might have questioned his removal of artifacts. Or, Holmes suggested quietly, he wished to avoid attention of a different sort entirely. Customs inspections at ports being rather more thorough than border crossings between allied nations, especially for parties presenting themselves as scholars rather than merchants. "Watson, we must speak with Morrison himself. Is he in London, Doctor?" "He was," Sutcliffe replied, "though I have not seen him in some weeks. He came once after delivering the artifacts, seemed distracted, troubled even. He asked peculiar questions about the gallery's security, about who might have access after hours. I assumed he was concerned about the safety of the items he had donated. But now—" He trailed off, looking again at the dissolving mandala with an expression approaching wonder. At that moment, footsteps echoed through the gallery. Not the soft scholarly tread they had heard earlier, but rather a heavier, more purposeful stride. A man appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the brighter light of the corridor beyond. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to physical exertion and outdoor life. His face was burned brown by high-altitude sun, deeply lined around the eyes, in the manner of those who have spent years squinting against snow, glare, and his hands, which hung at his sides, bore the scars and calluses of a mountaineer. "Sutcliffe," the man said, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone more comfortable with silence than speech. "Your message said there had been another incident. I came as quickly as—" He stopped, his gaze falling upon the mandala, and Watson saw his face undergo a remarkable transformation. Shock, certainly, but beneath it something more complex. Recognition, guilt, and perhaps a species of relief. "Morrison," Holmes said, before Sutcliffe could perform introductions. "Captain Harold Morrison, I presume, of the Himalayan Geographical Survey. Mountaineer, collector, and, if I am not mistaken, a man burdened by a secret that has allowed him neither rest nor peace since his return to England." Morrison's eyes, a pale blue, made paler still by contrast with his sun-darkened skin, moved from the mandala to Holmes with an expression that suggested a man standing on a precipice, uncertain whether to step back to safety or leap forward into whatever awaited below. "Who are you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson, and we are here because something you brought back from the Himalayas, or rather, someone, has taken refuge in London, far from home, alone and seeking connection with the only fragments of familiarity available in this vast and foreign city." The silence that followed these words seemed to expand to fill the entire gallery, pressing against the walls, rising toward the skylights where clouds had begun to gather, promising more rain for the afternoon. Morrison's face had gone pale beneath its weathering, and his hands, Watson noticed, had begun to tremble slightly, as though the weight he had been carrying had suddenly doubled, become unbearable. "I never meant," Morrison began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "You must understand, I never intended for any of this to happen. We encountered them high in the mountains, above the snow line, where nothing should live, nothing human at least. A small group, perhaps 6 or 7 individuals, living in caves near a glacier. They showed no fear of us, no aggression. Rather, they seemed curious, especially the young one. It followed our party for days, watching from distances, occasionally leaving gifts, flowers from impossible elevations, stones with peculiar markings. He moved into the gallery properly now, drawn toward the mandala despite his obvious distress, and knelt where Holmes had knelt earlier, his roughened hands hovering above the melting snow without quite touching it. The expedition's sponsors, you understand, they wanted proof, evidence of discovery. The botanical and geological samples, the artifacts, these were all well and good, but they wanted something sensational, something that would make headlines, ensure funding for future expeditions. A cup clattered somewhere in the museum's depths. Some visitor in another gallery startling at a display, or perhaps a curator dropping something in an office far away. And the small sound seemed to release Morrison from whatever paralysis had gripped him. He continued speaking, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as though confession could be made easier through quiet. "We drugged it. The young one, the one that had been following us, mixed sedatives into food we left out, potent enough to fell a horse. I told myself it was scientific, that we would keep it safe, study it, eventually return it to its home. But that was a lie I told myself to justify the unjustifiable. We transported it in a specially constructed crate, labelled as equipment, routing ourselves through regions where questions would be few. By the time we reached London, I was thoroughly ashamed of what I had done, but I could see no way to undo it. The creature was here, thousands of miles from its home, and I had no means to return it, no way to even explain what I had done without facing criminal charges and professional ruin." Watson felt a cold anger stirring in his chest, though it was tempered by the obvious remorse in Morrison's voice, the genuine anguish written across his features. The man was not a villain of melodrama, but rather something more common and more tragic. Someone who had made terrible choices and was now forced to live with their consequences. To wake each morning with the weight of his actions pressing upon his conscience. "Where is the creature now?" Morrison asked, looking up at Holmes with something approaching desperation. "Is it safe? Is it?" He paused, struggling with the question. "Is it suffering?" Holmes regarded him with an expression Watson could not quite read, something between judgment and understanding. the complex calculation of a man who had seen much of human weakness and had learned, through hard experience, that most people occupied spaces between heroism and villainy, capable of both cruelty and kindness depending on the moment and the circumstances. "The creature is safe," he said at last. "It has found shelter, warmth, and company. But it is not home, Captain Morrison, and that is a suffering that persists beneath all surface comfort, the ache of displacement, of exile, of existing in a world that was never meant to contain you." Outside the museum, the day had turned contemplative, neither fully bright nor dimly overcast, but rather existing in that peculiar state of suspended animation that London winter afternoons sometimes achieved, when time itself seemed to pause and wait for something unspoken to resolve itself. The three men, Holmes, Watson, and Morrison, emerged from the building's grand entrance and stood for a moment on the steps, each processing the revelations of the morning in his own way. Morrison had aged visibly in the past hour, the weight of confession having taken some essential vitality from him, leaving him diminished, hollowed out, though perhaps also strangely lighter, as guilt carried too long sometimes becomes. They walked without specific destination at first, moving instinctively away from the museum's crowds and toward the quieter streets that bordered Bloomsbury, where residential squares offered benches beneath bare trees, and the sounds of the city muffled themselves into gentle background texture. Holmes led them to a small park, really nothing more than a patch of green enclosed by iron railings. But it offered privacy, and the opportunity to speak without concern for who might overhear. They settled on a bench, worn smooth by years of occupation. Three men in dark coats, who might have been colleagues discussing business, or friends debating philosophy, or conspirators planning something that would never be spoken of again. Morrison had withdrawn a flask from his coat pocket and took a long pull before offering it to Watson, who declined with a gentle shake of his head. The captain's hands, Watson noticed, had steadied somewhat, as though the act of confession had restored some equilibrium that secrets had disturbed. A sparrow landed near their feet, pecking at the ground with that eternal optimism of urban birds who believe sustenance might appear anywhere, and its small movements created a pleasant punctuation to the silence that had settled over them. "I kept it, him, in a warehouse near the docks," Morrison said at length, his voice carrying across the park's quiet space like a stone dropped into still water. "A property I had leased ostensibly for storing expedition equipment. I visited daily, brought food, tried to create some semblance of comfort. But how does one comfort a creature torn from everything it knows? He never attacked me, never showed aggression. Instead, he would simply watch with those extraordinary eyes, and in that watching was an accusation more powerful than any violence could have been." Holmes had produced his pipe and was engaged in the ritual of filling and lighting it, the small clouds of smoke rising into the grey air like visible thoughts, dissipating as they climbed. "And yet he escaped," Holmes observed, not a question, but rather a statement inviting elaboration. "3 weeks ago," Morrison confirmed. "I arrived one morning to find the door open. Not broken, mind you, but carefully, methodically opened from the inside. The lock had been dismantled with remarkable precision, the mechanism laid out on the floor as though to demonstrate understanding of how such things functioned. There was no trail to follow, no indication of which direction he had taken. I reported it to no one, for what could I say? that I had lost a creature I should never have possessed, brought to England through methods that would see me imprisoned if discovered. A gust of wind moved through the park, setting the bare branches to clicking against each other, with sounds like distant percussion, and Watson pulled his coat more tightly closed against the chill. Somewhere nearby, a church bell marked the hour with measured strokes that counted out time in that ancient way that predated clocks and schedules, when time had been measured in prayers and the movement of celestial bodies rather than the industrial precision of modern life. "The warehouse," Holmes said, removing his pipe long enough to speak with clarity. "I shall need its location. There may be items there, traces, things that will help us understand his journey and perhaps his needs. But first, Captain Morrison, I require your commitment to a course of action that will demand both courage and resources. Can you provide these?" Morrison's response came without hesitation, his voice carrying the weight of a vow made in the presence of witnesses who would hold him to its fulfillment. "Anything, everything. Tell me what must be done, and it shall be done. I have money saved, contacts throughout Asia, experience in high-altitude travel. If there is a way to return him to his home, to undo even partially what I have done, then I am yours to command." The conversation that followed was practical in its details, but extraordinary in its implications. They discussed routes and methods, the logistics of transporting a creature of considerable size across continents without attracting unwanted attention, the question of how one might locate a specific cave system in the vastness of the Himalayan range. Morrison had maps, detailed records of his expedition, photographs that he had never shared with the museum or his sponsors because they contained evidence of what he now acknowledged as his crime. These materials, he assured them, would provide the foundation for planning a return journey, though the technical challenges remained formidable. The discussion carried them through the lengthening afternoon, until the light began to fade, and the gas lamps sputtered to life along the street, their yellow glow creating pools of warmth in the gathering darkness. Finally, Holmes stood, signalling their meeting's end, and extended his hand to Morrison with a formality that transformed the gesture into something approaching ritual. "Return to your lodgings and gather all materials relevant to the expedition. Bring them to Baker Street tomorrow morning at 9. Until then, speak of this to no one, and trust that your burden is now shared, which makes it lighter if not yet resolved." The journey back to Baker Street passed in contemplative silence, Holmes and Watson walking side by side through streets now busy with evening commerce, workers returning home, shops lighting their windows against the coming night. The city had that particular energy that belonged to the cusp between day and evening, when one phase of urban life concluded and another began, when the quality of light changed and shadows grew long and purposeful. They stopped briefly at a shop that catered to travellers, where Holmes purchased several items whose purpose he did not explain, and then continued homeward. Mrs. Hudson met them at the door with an expression that combined relief and exasperation in equal measure. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank goodness you have returned. Your guest, and really, I must insist, we discuss the propriety of housing such unusual visitors without prior notice, has been pacing the sitting room for the past hour. Not destructively, mind you, but with such evident distress that I found myself quite concerned." They climbed the stairs rapidly, hearing as they approached the sound that Mrs. Hudson had described, footsteps far heavier than human, moving back and forth with a rhythmic quality of profound agitation. Holmes opened the door to find their guest indeed pacing, moving from window to fireplace and back again, pausing occasionally to examine the note Holmes had left that morning, as though reading it repeatedly might yield some meaning that had previously escaped notice. The creature's reaction to their return was immediate and unmistakable. The pacing ceased, and it moved toward them with surprising speed, stopping just short of actual contact, but clearly communicating relief, perhaps even joy, through posture and that low resonant sound that had become familiar as a form of speech. Holmes stepped forward without hesitation, reaching out to lay one hand on the creature's massive arm, a gesture that bridged the space between species, between the known and the unknown, establishing connection through simple touch. "We have been working on your behalf," Holmes said quietly, speaking with the same careful enunciation he had used throughout their interactions, convinced that tone and intention carried across language barriers in ways that specific words might not. "We have met the man who brought you here, and he wishes to make amends. We are planning your return home, though the journey will require time to arrange properly." Whether the creature understood the specific content of Holmes's words, or simply responded to the reassurance in his voice, Watson could not say with certainty, but its agitation visibly decreased, the tension flowing out of its frame like water from an opened vessel. It moved back to its preferred spot near the fire, and settled there with evident satisfaction, and in settling seemed to indicate trust, or at least willingness to wait, to allow these strange beings, who had shown it kindness, to work toward whatever resolution they proposed. Watson busied himself with practical matters, requesting that Mrs. Hudson bring tea and the remainder of the previous night's roast, which she did with remarkably good grace, considering the unprecedented nature of their house guest. The evening settled into a pattern that felt almost domestic. Holmes in his chair, reviewing notes and sketching out preliminary plans for the journey to come. Watson attending to correspondence that had accumulated during the day's adventures, and their guest consuming food with that same careful deliberation, occasionally making soft sounds that might have been contentment or simply acknowledgement of present comfort despite larger displacement. The fire burned steady and warm, its light painting the room in shades of amber and gold, casting shadows that moved with gentle rhythms across the walls. Outside, night completed its daily conquest of the sky, and somewhere in the distance, fog was rolling in from the river, that characteristic London fog that transformed familiar streets into mysterious landscapes where anything seemed possible, where the boundaries between real and imagined grew permeable and soft. In the sitting room of 221B Baker Street, three beings from vastly different origins shared space and warmth, and something that transcended language or custom, a recognition of fundamental kinship, of the universal needs that connected all conscious creatures: safety, sustenance, and the hope of eventually finding one's way home. The grandfather clock in the corner of the sitting room had been marking time with its brass pendulum for longer than anyone currently living could remember, its mechanism so old and so perfectly maintained that each tick carried the weight of history, generations of moments measured out in patient mechanical rhythm. Watson found himself watching that pendulum now, the way it caught firelight on each swing, creating small arcs of brilliance that pulsed like a heartbeat, visible, tangible, reassuring in its absolute constancy. 3 beings breathed in that room, 3 sets of lungs drawing air and releasing it. But the clock's pulse seemed to unite them, establishing a metronome against which all other rhythms organized themselves. Their guest had fallen into what appeared to be genuine sleep, though Watson, with his physician's instinct for observation, noted that even in rest the creature maintained a quality of alertness, ears that swiveled slightly toward unexpected sounds, fingers that occasionally flexed as though grasping at something in dreams. The white fur rose and fell with breathing that had settled into the deep, slow pattern of true relaxation, and occasionally small sounds emerged, not words exactly, but rather vocalizations that suggested some inner narrative playing out beyond conscious awareness. Watson wondered what a creature displaced so far from home might dream of. Mountain peaks touched by stars, perhaps, or the companionship of its own kind, or simply the particular quality of cold that existed only at altitudes where humans could not survive. Holmes had abandoned his chair and moved to the large table that dominated one wall of the sitting room, spreading across its surface a collection of maps that he had retrieved from the extensive archives he maintained in various boxes and filing systems throughout their lodgings. India, Nepal, Tibet. The geographical designations meant little in those high reaches where national boundaries dissolved into the more fundamental reality of stone and ice and the limits of human habitation. He had weighted the corners with various objects: a magnifying glass, a tobacco tin, a small bronze Buddha that had been acquired during some previous case, and a teacup that had gone cold an hour ago but remained where it had been set, forgotten in the intensity of study. Watson rose, careful not to disturb their sleeping guest, and moved to join Holmes at the table. The maps were old, some dating back decades, their paper yellowed and fragile at the creases, where they had been folded and unfolded countless times by explorers and surveyors charting territories that resisted easy classification. Holmes's long fingers traced routes with the delicacy of someone reading Braille, following the contour lines that represented elevation, pausing at notations that indicated passes, monasteries, settlements clinging to existence in the thin air. The logistics are daunting, Holmes murmured, speaking barely above a whisper to preserve the room's peaceful atmosphere. Even assuming we can secure Morrison's full cooperation and resources, the journey itself presents challenges that are not merely physical, but diplomatic, political. These regions exist at the intersection of competing interests: British, Russian, Chinese, various local powers who view outsiders with justifiable suspicion. Watson studied the maps, noting the vast emptiness they represented, the spaces between marked locations that could encompass days or weeks of travel across terrain that resisted human passage. And yet, Morrison made the journey once already, in both directions. Surely the same routes could be followed in reverse. In theory, Holmes agreed, though his tone suggested complications. But Morrison was part of an official survey, carrying documents and permissions that granted him access. We would be travelling for purposes that cannot be officially acknowledged, carrying a passenger whose very existence challenges accepted understanding of what is possible. Discretion will be paramount, which means avoiding the standard routes, the places where questions would be asked, and officials might take unwelcome interest. A log in the fireplace shifted, settling deeper into the grate with a soft collapse that sent sparks spiraling upward into the chimney's darkness. The sound drew Watson's attention back to their guest, who stirred slightly, but did not wake, merely adjusted position in that unconscious way all creatures do when seeking optimal comfort. The firelight played across white fur, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that transformed the creature into something almost mythological, a being from ancient stories made flesh and breath and undeniable presence. The evening deepened toward night proper, that hour when London's ceaseless activity finally diminished to its lowest ebb, when even the most determined revellers had found their way home, and the city rested, not sleeping exactly, but achieving something close to stillness. Mrs. Hudson had retired to her quarters below, having first ensured that blankets and pillows had been arranged on the settee should either Holmes or Watson wish to rest without retreating to their bedrooms. A tray of sandwiches sat on the sideboard, along with a fresh pot of tea kept warm under a quilted cosy, these provisions made without comment, but with the understanding that the night might require sustenance at irregular hours. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, a question forming that he was not certain how to articulate. "Do you suppose there are others? Back in those mountains, I mean. A family, perhaps, or a community that mourns this absence?" Holmes looked up from the maps, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that made them seem to glow from within. Morrison spoke of 6 or 7 individuals observed during his expedition. Whether that represents the entirety of the species in that region, or merely one small group among many, we cannot know with certainty. But yes, Watson, I believe there are others. The marks carved in our cellar, the mandala created in the museum, these are not the actions of a solitary creature, but rather of one who understands symbolic communication, who possesses cultural knowledge that must be learned and transmitted. Such things require community, require teaching and context. Our guest is alone here, but was not alone there, and that knowledge of what has been lost must make the displacement infinitely more painful. The observation settled over them like additional weight, making the task they had undertaken seem even more essential and urgent. To return one being to its home was not merely an act of kindness, but a partial restoration of something larger, a family, a culture, a way of being that had been violated by Morrison's ambition and the thoughtless assumption that knowledge justified any method of acquisition. A sound from outside broke their contemplation. The rattle of a carriage pulling up in the street below, the jingle of harness and the call of a driver bringing his horse to a stop. Both men moved to the window, peering down through the curtain to see a hansom cab illuminated by the street lamp, and emerging from it, a figure they recognized even in the uncertain light. Morrison had returned, far earlier than expected, and he carried with him a large leather case that he handled with evident care despite its considerable weight. He could not wait until morning, Holmes observed, with something approaching approval. Good. Urgency serves us well in this matter. Watson, would you admit him? I believe our planning session is about to become considerably more productive. Watson descended the stairs and opened the door to find Morrison on the step, his face drawn with exhaustion, but animated by something else as well. Determination, perhaps, or the particular energy that comes from having committed oneself fully to a course of action after long paralysis of indecision. "Mr. Holmes asked you to come tomorrow," Watson said gently, "but you are welcome now if you prefer." "I could not sleep," Morrison replied simply. And if I am to make amends, then every hour of delay is an hour longer that he remains in exile. The materials Holmes requested, I have everything. Maps, journals, photographs, even samples of the vegetation from the altitude where I found him. Everything that might help ensure his safe return. They climbed the stairs together, Watson leading the way, and entered the sitting room to find that their guest had awakened and now sat upright, watching the door with that same intense attention Watson had observed before. The creature's gaze fixed on Morrison with an expression that Watson found himself unable to read. Was it recognition, accusation, forgiveness? Perhaps all of these at once, or perhaps emotions that existed outside human categories entirely. Feelings for which English possessed no adequate vocabulary. Morrison stopped just inside the doorway, still holding his leather case, and for a long moment the two regarded each other across the space of the sitting room. Captor and captive, though those words felt inadequate now, too simple for the complexity of what had transpired and what existed between them. Then Morrison did something that surprised Watson profoundly. He lowered himself to one knee, setting the case carefully aside, and bowed his head in a gesture of submission and apology that transcended language or culture, speaking in the universal vocabulary of remorse and supplication. The creature watched this display without moving, its great chest rising and falling with measured breaths. And then it made that low, resonant sound, but different now, carrying tones that suggested something other than the communication Watson had heard before. Not affirmation or acknowledgement, but perhaps something closer to acceptance, or the beginning of forgiveness, or simply the recognition that they were all, in their different ways, trying to navigate circumstances that none had chosen and all must now address together. Holmes moved forward, extending his hand to help Morrison rise, and gestured toward the table where the maps waited. Come, Captain, let us plan a journey that will, if fortune and careful preparation favour us, undo at least some of the harm that has been done, and restore what was taken to the place where it belongs, where it can again know the particular cold of high altitudes and the companionship of its own kind, where it can be not a curiosity or a captive, but simply itself, living as it was meant to live in the only place that can truly be called home. The leather case opened with a sound like a sigh, brass clasps releasing their hold to reveal contents packed with the meticulous care of someone who understood that these materials represented more than mere documentation. They were evidence. Confessi were evidence. Confession. And now, hopefully, the foundation for redemption. Morrison's hands, still bearing the slight tremor that had not quite left them since his arrival, lifted out the first bundle of papers, journals bound in oilcloth to protect them from moisture, their pages filled with handwriting that varied from neat scholarly notation to hasty field scribbles made in conditions that did not favour precision. Holmes received these offerings with the reverence one might accord sacred texts, spreading them across the table's surface with careful deliberation, arranging them not chronologically, but rather by some internal logic that Watson had learned to trust, even when he could not immediately perceive its structure. The journals fell open to pages marked with pressed flowers, now brittle and faded, their original colours reduced to shades of brown and grey, yet still retaining something of their essential form. Alpine specimens from elevations where flowering required strategies that lowland plants could never comprehend. Their guest had risen from its resting place and now approached the table, drawn by some instinct or curiosity that overrode caution. Watson watched its face as it looked upon the journals, the maps, the carefully preserved plant specimens, and saw recognition there. Not of the specific items, perhaps, but of what they represented. Home, rendered in paper and ink and dried vegetation. Fragments of a world compressed into forms that could be carried across continents, but could never truly contain the vastness they purported to represent. Morrison had begun speaking, his voice low and deliberate, narrating the expedition's progress through entries that charted not only geographical coordinates, but also the gradual transformation of a scientific endeavour into something else entirely. "We departed from Darjeeling in March," he said, his finger tracing a route on the largest map, moving north through Sikkim with official permissions that extended only to certain boundaries. Beyond those, we entered territories where maps became more speculation than fact, where the inhabitants viewed us with suspicion earned through generations of foreign incursion. The fire crackled, sending up a small shower of sparks that danced briefly before expiring, and Watson moved to add another log, carefully selecting one of appropriate size and dryness, placing it with the care his military training had instilled. Even small actions performed with precision, because precision was the difference between success and failure, between life and death in circumstances where margins were thin. The new log caught quickly, flames spreading across its surface like eager fingers exploring unfamiliar territory. Holmes had extracted a magnifying glass and was examining something in one of the journals. A sketch, Watson saw, leaning closer, rendered with considerable artistic skill, despite having been executed in what must have been challenging conditions. It depicted a mountain face, steep and forbidding, with what appeared to be cave openings marked at various heights. Annotations in Morrison's hand identified features, estimated distances, noted the presence of what he had described as unusual architectural modifications suggesting long-term habitation. "Here," Morrison said, pointing to a specific cave entrance marked with a small cross. "This is where I observed them most frequently. The young one." He paused, glancing toward their guest with evident discomfort at referring to it in such terms while it stood present, listening. He would emerge in the early morning when the light was still grey and uncertain, and sit on this ledge watching the sunrise. I photographed him once without his awareness, and the image haunts me still. The expression captured there, I have never seen anything quite like it. Wonder, perhaps, or contemplation, or simply the face of a being experiencing beauty in its most pure and undiluted form. Watson thought about that moment, a creature emerging from its home into alpine dawn, sitting in the thin, cold air, watching light spill across peaks that had existed long before humans walked the earth, and would continue long after humanity's tenure concluded. The image possessed a quality that transcended species, spoke to something fundamental about consciousness itself, the capacity to observe beauty and be moved by it, to experience the world not merely as a collection of resources or threats, but as something worthy of attention for its own sake. Their guest had been studying the sketch with evident intensity, and now it reached out one massive hand, hovering over the image without quite touching it, as though the paper were too fragile or too precious to risk contact. It made a sound then, different from any Watson had heard before, higher pitched, more complex, carrying in its tonal variations something that might have been language, actual words, in whatever form of communication its species employed. The sound rose and fell, repeated certain patterns, seemed to be conveying information, or perhaps asking questions, that Morrison could not possibly answer, but whose intent was unmistakable. Holmes had straightened from his examination and was watching this interaction with that particular quality of attention he brought to observations that might prove pivotal. "Captain Morrison," he said quietly, "during your time observing them, did you attempt to document their vocalizations, to determine if they possessed structured communication?" Morrison nodded slowly. "I made recordings, Edison cylinders. They are among my materials, though I confess I lacked the expertise to analyze them properly. The sounds seemed to follow patterns, but whether they constituted language in any formal sense, I could not determine with certainty. They also used gesture extensively, and what appeared to be artistic expression. I found several cave walls marked with symbols, some painted, others carved, arranged in sequences that suggested narrative or perhaps ritual significance. Watson watched as Holmes's eyes lit with the particular gleam that indicated mental gears engaging at maximum speed, connections forming between disparate pieces of information, patterns emerging from what had seemed chaos. "The mandala in the museum," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to the others. "The symbols carved in our cellar. Not random artistic impulse, but rather communication attempted through the only means available. Watson, we have been in the presence of language all along, simply language we lacked the capacity to properly receive and interpret. A church bell tolled somewhere in the night, its bronze voice carrying across rooftops and through narrow streets, marking an hour that Watson had lost track of. Was it 10? 11? Time had become fluid in the sitting room, measured not by the clock's relentless progression, but rather by the gradual accumulation of understanding, the slow construction of a bridge between worlds that had seemed impossibly separated. Mrs. Hudson's voice called up from below, polite, but carrying the undertone of someone whose patience, while considerable, had its limits. "Mr. Holmes, it is quite late, and I wonder if perhaps your guest might benefit from more formal sleeping arrangements. I have prepared the spare room with additional bedding, and really, the settee cannot be comfortable for a being of such considerable size." Holmes called back assurances and thanks, and Watson saw their guest's attention shift toward the doorway, clearly understanding that some discussion of its comfort was occurring, even if the specific words remained opaque. Morrison had continued unpacking his case, producing now a series of photographs mounted on heavy cardstock, their silver gelatin surfaces capturing moments from the expedition in shades of grey that somehow conveyed more than colour ever could: the stark beauty of ice fields, the vertiginous perspectives of mountain faces, and finally, images of the beings Morrison had observed. Watson drew in a sharp breath as he studied these photographs. There were indeed 6 or 7 individuals visible across various images, ranging in size from what must have been adolescents to fully mature adults, their white fur and powerful builds adapted perfectly for their environment. But it was their behaviour captured in these frozen moments that arrested attention. One photograph showed what appeared to be a teaching scene, an adult demonstrating something to 2 smaller individuals who watched with evident concentration. Another depicted what could only be described as play. multiple individuals engaged in some form of physical game or contest, their postures suggesting joy, engagement, community. "These are not animals," Watson said softly, though he was merely voicing what all of them had already understood. "These are people, different from us, yes, adapted to circumstances we could never survive, but people nonetheless, with culture and relationships, and all the complex inner lives that word implies." Their guest had moved closer to examine the photographs, and Watson saw its hand reach out to touch one image in particular, the teaching scene. The massive fingers, capable of such strength, touched the photograph with impossible gentleness, tracing the outline of the adult figure there, and the sound it made then was unmistakable in its emotional content, despite the alien phonetics. Grief, longing, love, these were not uniquely human emotions, Watson realized, but rather the currency of consciousness itself, the inevitable consequence of beings capable of forming attachments, of recognizing kinship, of understanding loss. Morrison had produced one final item from his case, a small wooden object, intricately carved, depicting forms that Watson initially took for abstract patterns, but which resolved, upon closer inspection, into highly stylized representations of the mountain beings themselves, arranged in postures that suggested ritual or dance. "I found this cached in one of the caves," Morrison explained, his voice thick with emotion. "It was wrapped in preserved leaves, carefully hidden. I believe it may have been important, possibly ceremonial. Taking it was yet another violation, though at the time I told myself it was preservation, scientific documentation. Now I see it for what it was: theft of the most intimate sort, the removal of cultural artifacts from people who had done nothing to warrant such treatment." Holmes had taken the carved object and was examining it with that complete absorption he brought to truly significant evidence. He turned it slowly, studying each surface, and then he did something that surprised Watson. He offered it to their guest, holding it out with both hands in a gesture that was somehow both offering and request. The creature took it, and for the first time since Watson had met it, he saw something like joy transform its features, a relaxation of the melancholy that had seemed its default expression, replaced by recognition, by connection with something that held meaning beyond the merely functional. The carved object seemed to fit the creature's hands as though made for them specifically, and perhaps it had been. Perhaps this was a personal possession, something created by or for the individual Morrison had drugged and stolen, something that should never have left its owner. But now, through these strange, circuitous routes that fate sometimes took, had been returned. The creature held it against its chest, making soft sounds that needed no translation. And in that moment, the sitting room of 221B Baker Street became something more than a collection of furniture and firelight. It became a space where what had been broken might begin, however tentatively, to heal. Steam rose from the teacup in lazy spirals, catching lamplight as it climbed toward the ceiling, where it dissipated into nothing. Each curl and eddy following patterns that seemed random, but obeyed laws as fixed as gravity, as immutable as the turning of planets. Watson watched this small atmospheric theatre, while his mind processed what the past hours had revealed. Not merely facts about expedition routes and mountain geography, but deeper truths about consciousness and kinship, about the terrible ease with which good intentions could mask profound violations. The tea itself had gone lukewarm, forgotten in the intensity of their discussions. But he held the cup regardless, finding comfort in its weight, its solidity, something tangible to anchor him, while contemplating abstractions that resisted easy categorization. Their guest had settled near the window, the carved wooden object still held with careful reverence, occasionally lifting it to examine in the varied light. Firelight from one angle, lamplight from another, each illumination revealing different aspects of the intricate work. The creature's posture spoke of a contentment that had been absent before, as though this small connection with home, however inadequate, provided sustenance that went beyond physical nourishment. Outside, the night had achieved that particular depth that came in the hours after midnight, when even London's inexhaustible energy finally ebbed, leaving streets quiet enough that individual sounds, a cat's cry, a constable's footsteps, the distant clatter of a late train, carried across distances with unusual clarity. Holmes and Morrison remained bent over the table where maps and journals created a topographical study of paper, their heads close together as they debated routes and possibilities, speaking in the shorthand that develops between people engaged in complex planning, where every detail matters, and small oversights could prove catastrophic. Watson listened with half his attention, while the other half drifted, his medical training asserting itself in observations about their guest's physical state. Breathing regular and unlaboured, movements fluid despite the obvious unfamiliarity of the environment. No signs of illness or distress beyond the psychological burden of displacement. Morrison had produced a detailed itinerary from memory, supplemented by notes he had kept meticulously despite the personal anguish they represented. The return journey would need to begin from Liverpool, he explained, pointing to locations on a world map that had been unrolled atop the more detailed regional charts. A steamer to Bombay, approximately 3 weeks, depending on weather and coaling stops. From there, the rail network extends north to Calcutta, and beyond that, it becomes a matter of road travel through increasingly difficult terrain until roads cease altogether and only footpaths remain. Holmes had been making calculations on a sheet of paper, his pencil moving with rapid precision as he worked through logistics that involved not only distance and time, but also the more nebulous factors of discretion and opportunity. The challenge lies not in the journey itself, he observed, but in maintaining appropriate cover while travelling with a companion who cannot simply be hidden in luggage or explained away as conventional cargo. We require a framework that makes the presence of our friend here, seem unremarkable, or at least sufficiently explained that curiosity does not become investigation. A log shifted in the fireplace with a sound like a sigh, and Watson rose to attend it, using the poker to adjust the burning wood into more efficient arrangement. Watching sparks spiral upward into the chimney's throat, where they disappeared into darkness. Their brief existence measured in seconds, but somehow feeling significant, as though each small light carried meaning beyond its momentary flare. The heat from the fire pressed against his face, making him acutely aware of temperature gradients. The way warmth decreased with distance until, just a few feet back, the room's ambient chill reasserted itself. A circus, Morrison said suddenly, his voice carrying the surprise of inspiration, arriving unexpectedly. Or rather, a travelling exhibition of scientific curiosities. Such enterprises move constantly, are expected to contain unusual contents, and are granted considerable latitude, precisely because their purpose is to display the remarkable, We could construct a wagon, specially fitted for comfort and safety, labelled as containing a rare specimen being transported for educational purposes. The paperwork would need to be convincing, but that can be arranged through contacts I maintain in various colonial offices. Watson saw Holmes's expression shift, the skepticism that had initially appeared, giving way to consideration as he worked through implications. The advantage being, Holmes said slowly, that any precautions we take for comfort and dignity, proper heating, regular stops for rest and food, privacy from prying eyes, all become not merely acceptable but expected behaviours for handlers of valuable specimens. The deception serves the truth, paradoxically, by allowing us to provide appropriate care while travelling through territories where that care might otherwise invite unwanted questions. Their guest had turned from the window and was watching this exchange with evident attention, and Watson wondered again at the depth of comprehension present in that gaze. Could it understand English? Or did it simply read intent and emotion from tone and gesture, picking up meanings that transcended specific vocabulary? The question felt less important than the recognition that communication was occurring, that understanding flowed between beings, despite the absence of shared language, carried by those channels that existed beneath and beyond words: expression, posture, the quality of attention given and received. Morrison had pulled another journal from his case, this one containing not field notes, but rather detailed sketches of what he described as technological considerations. Designs for a travelling enclosure that would provide security without becoming imprisonment, incorporating ventilation and viewing ports that could be covered or opened depending on circumstances. I began these plans weeks ago, he admitted, before I knew if recovery would even be possible, before I could admit to myself what I had done and what amends might require. But I could not sit idle with knowledge of the suffering I had caused, so I planned, hoping that opportunity might somehow arise. The clock struck 2, its chimes seeming particularly loud in the night stillness, and Watson felt the weight of the hour, the way accumulated wakefulness pressed against his consciousness like a physical thing. Yet sleep felt impossible, inappropriate even, when matters of such consequence required attention. He moved to the sideboard, where Mrs. Hudson had left sandwiches hours ago, finding them still edible if no longer fresh, and distributed them among the company. Holmes accepted absently, Morrison with gratitude, and their guest with that same careful delicacy that characterized all its interactions with human things. The discussion continued, moving from broad strategy to specific details. The composition of their travelling party, the story they would tell at various checkpoints, the supplies required not merely for the journey, but for the period after arrival, when Morrison would need to navigate delicate negotiations with the local community to ensure safe return to the exact location from which their guest had been taken. This last point generated considerable debate, as Morrison expressed concern that his previous presence might have created suspicion or hostility that could complicate reintroduction. Then, we do not arrive with the presumption of welcome, Holmes suggested, but rather with the humility of supplicants seeking to correct transgression. Captain Morrison, you possess certain advantages: knowledge of the location, understanding of the terrain, experience in high-altitude survival. But you also carry the burden of being the architect of this displacement. Perhaps it would be appropriate to travel with gifts, offerings that demonstrate not merely regret, but genuine respect for the culture you violated. Watson watched their guest during this exchange and saw something remarkable. Tears, unmistakable despite the alien features, tracking slowly through white fur to catch firelight in their descent. Not tears of anguish, Watson thought, but rather something more complex, a response to being discussed, not as object or problem, but as individual with rights and feelings, with a home that mattered, and people who would welcome return. The tears spoke of hope, perhaps, or relief, or simply the emotional release that comes when long-carried burdens begin to lighten. Morrison had seen the tears as well, and his face contorted with emotions that warred visibly: shame and determination, regret and resolve. He stood from the table and approached their guest with none of the confidence he had displayed when discussing logistics, but rather with the uncertain gait of someone walking across ice, testing each step before committing weight. When he reached speaking distance, he stopped and met those luminous eyes directly, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual authority, only naked honesty. "I cannot undo what I have done," Morrison said, each word seeming to cost him something. "I cannot restore the time you have lost, cannot erase the suffering my actions caused. But I swear to you, on whatever honor I have left, that I will dedicate every resource at my disposal, every ounce of strength and knowledge I possess, to returning you to your home. And when we arrive, I will face whatever judgment your people deem appropriate, will accept whatever consequences my actions warrant. This is not redemption. I am not sure redemption is even possible for what I have done, but it is the only path forward I can see, the only way to begin addressing an injustice that can never be fully balanced." The silence that followed possessed extraordinary weight, filled with the soft sounds of fire and clock and breathing. And then their guest extended one massive hand and placed it with infinite gentleness on Morrison's shoulder. The gesture needed no translation, carried meaning that transcended species and language, acknowledgement, perhaps, or the beginning of forgiveness, or simply recognition that they were all, in their different ways, trying to navigate towards something better than what circumstances had created. Morrison's shoulders shook with silent tears, and Watson looked away, granting privacy to a moment too intimate for observation, focusing instead on the fire where flames continued their eternal dance, indifferent to human drama, burning simply because that was their nature, consuming fuel and creating light and warmth without judgment or expectation. Holmes had returned to the maps, but Watson could see that his friend's attention was elsewhere, his mind working through dimensions that had nothing to do with geography. When he finally spoke, his voice carried unusual gentleness, the tone he reserved for moments when the weight of human complexity pressed heavily. "It is late, and we have done what we can for tonight. Tomorrow, or rather, later today, we will begin the practical work of preparation. Captain Morrison, I suggest you return to your lodgings and rest. We will need you alert and capable in the days ahead. Watson and I will ensure our guest is comfortable, and in the morning we will begin transforming plans into action." Morrison gathered his materials with reluctant care, clearly torn between exhaustion and unwillingness to leave. But Holmes's suggestion carried the weight of command, and the captain departed, with promises to return at first light. The sitting room felt larger with his absence, quieter, though the essential occupants remained. Holmes, Watson, and their extraordinary guest, three beings united by circumstance into a conspiracy of kindness, working toward an end that served no purpose but the restoration of what had been displaced, the healing of what had been broken, the acknowledgement that consciousness, wherever it appeared and however it manifested, deserved recognition, respect, and the fundamental right to exist in the place and manner that nature or fate, or the mysterious workings of existence, had originally intended. Dawn arrived, not with fanfare, but with gradual softening, the darkness outside the windows thinning by imperceptible degrees, until what had been night became something else entirely. Not yet day, but rather that liminal si'apul, rather that liminal space between states, where the world held its breath and waited for transformation to complete itself. Watson had drifted into sleep at some point during those small hours, his body finally overruling his mind's insistence on wakefulness, and he woke now to find himself covered with a blanket he did not remember retrieving, slumped in his chair with his neck at an angle that would require attention from muscles currently lodging formal complaints. The fire had been tended while he slept, fresh logs arranged with the precision that marked Holmes's hand, burning with that steady confidence of a well-built fire that would last for hours without intervention. Their guest remained near the window where Watson had last seen it, though its position had shifted slightly, suggesting it too had found some manner of rest during the night's passage. The carved wooden object rested in its lap, held loosely now in sleep's relaxation, and the creature's face in repose carried an expression that Watson could only describe as peaceful, the first genuine peace he had observed since that initial discovery in the cellar, that felt simultaneously like yesterday and like weeks ago, time having become elastic and strange in the way it sometimes did when extraordinary events compressed ordinary experience. Holmes stood at the window, his silhouette dark against the growing light, and Watson recognized the posture. His friend had not slept at all, had instead spent the hours in that peculiar state of alert contemplation that Holmes could maintain far longer than seemed humanly possible, his mind working through problems and possibilities, while his body remained still as stone. He did not turn as Watson stirred, but spoke anyway, having somehow registered the small sounds of waking through whatever mysterious perception allowed him to track such things. "Mrs. Hudson has been awake for an hour already," Holmes said quietly. "I hear her moving about below, preparing breakfast for what she has undoubtedly calculated will be an unusual number of guests. She has adapted to our current circumstances with remarkable grace, though I suspect we will face considerable questioning once this matter reaches its conclusion. She is owed explanations, and I intend to provide them, though I confess uncertainty about where to begin or how much will be believed." Watson rose carefully, allowing his body to protest and adjust in its own time, and joined Holmes at the window. Baker Street below was beginning its daily transformation from sleeping residential quarter to bustling thoroughfare. A milk cart making its rounds, a chimney sweep with his brushes and rods trudging towards some appointment, a governess leading two small children who walked with that particular reluctance of young people being taken somewhere they had not chosen to go. Ordinary London life, continuing its patterns with sublime indifference to the extraordinary events unfolding in the sitting room above. "Morrison will arrive within the hour," Holmes continued, still gazing out at the street, "and we have considerable work ahead. papers to forge or acquire through legitimate channels, depending on which proves more expedient, supplies to purchase that will raise no suspicions, yet serve their actual purpose, and most delicately, the construction of that travelling enclosure Morrison sketched. It must be secure enough to satisfy official scrutiny, yet comfortable enough to honour the dignity of its occupant. A challenging balance, but not impossible for skilled craftsmen working from precise specifications. A knock at the door below announced the first arrival of the morning, not Morrison, but rather a messenger, whose voice Watson heard in brief exchange with Mrs. Hudson before footsteps ascended the stairs. A boy of perhaps 12 appeared, cap in hand, offering an envelope with the self-importance of someone entrusted with important correspondence. Holmes accepted it with a coin that made the boy's eyes widen, and waited until the messenger had departed before breaking the seal. "From Inspector Lestrade," Holmes said, scanning the contents with that rapid eye movement that suggested he was reading not merely words, but also implications and subtexts invisible to ordinary perception. Interesting. He writes that the museum authorities have decided not to pursue investigation of the snow mandala incident, deeming it a harmless prank without monetary loss. They have, however, increased night security, which may complicate any future visitations. Not that such visits will be necessary, given our current plans, but the information is useful nonetheless. Their guest had begun to stir, waking with the gradual progression of large creatures, a slow gathering of awareness that preceded actual movement. Watson found himself wondering about its dreams again. Did it revisit mountains in sleep, walk through familiar landscapes now impossibly distant? Or did sleep bring mercy, offering temporary respite from the ache of displacement? The creature's eyes opened fully, focusing first on the carved object it held, then moving to take in the room and its occupants, with what seemed like genuine pleasure, as though waking to find them still present was a small but significant comfort. Mrs. Hudson arrived with breakfast, not her usual simple fare, but rather a spread that suggested she had been cooking for considerably longer than the hour Holmes had mentioned. There were eggs and bacon, certainly, but also fresh bread still steaming from the oven, preserves in small crystal dishes, a large bowl of porridge with cream and honey, and what appeared to be an entire roasted chicken, its skin golden and crisp, accompanied by potatoes and carrots. She arranged these offerings with brisk efficiency, refusing Watson's attempts to help, and addressed the room at large without quite looking at their extraordinary guest. "I have prepared what I hope will be adequate sustenance for all present," she said, her tone suggesting that questions about appropriate quantities for beings of unusual size would not be entertained. "There is also a considerable amount of tea, and coffee should anyone prefer it. Mr. Holmes, the tradesmen will begin arriving shortly. You mentioned needing carpenters and metal workers. I have taken the liberty of contacting several who have done work for us previously, and can be trusted with discretion." Holmes's expression softened in the way it rarely did, revealing genuine appreciation for practical assistance that anticipated needs before they were articulated. "Mrs. Hudson, you are invaluable. Please show them up when they arrive, and inform them that the project is both urgent and confidential, but that compensation will reflect both those qualities." The meal proceeded with the comfortable quiet of people who had moved beyond the need for constant conversation, each occupied with their own thoughts while sharing space and sustenance. Their guest ate with evident enjoyment, and Watson found himself hoping that memory might carry some trace of this morning forward, might provide occasional comfort during whatever challenges lay ahead. The memory of warmth and food and companions who had, despite vast differences, recognized kinship and acted accordingly. Morrison arrived as predicted, looking somewhat restored by a few hours of rest, though shadows beneath his eyes spoke of sleep that had been neither deep nor particularly peaceful. He brought with him not only his leather case, but also a large rolled document that proved, when spread across the now cleared table, to be architectural plans of remarkable detail. The travelling enclosure design had been refined considerably, incorporating features that balanced every possible concern: structural integrity, ventilation, temperature control, security that could be locked from inside as well as outside, viewing ports that could be opened or covered at the occupant's discretion. "I worked through the night," Morrison explained, his finger tracing various elements of the design. "I could not rest, knowing that details remained unresolved. Here, this double wall construction provides insulation, while also creating space for storage of supplies. And these reinforcements allow the entire structure to be lifted and loaded onto various conveyances, ship, railcar, cart, without requiring transfer of the occupant. The external appearance suggests scientific equipment, deliberately uninteresting to casual observers, while the interior provides reasonable comfort." The morning progressed in a flurry of activity that transformed the sitting room into something resembling a military planning headquarters. The tradesmen arrived. First, a carpenter, whose weathered hands suggested decades of skilled work. Then, a metal worker, who brought samples of hinges and locks for inspection. And finally, a supplier of fabrics, who carried swatches of materials suitable for interior padding and insulation. Each received the same briefing. The project was unusual. Confidentiality was paramount, and quality was not to be compromised for the sake of speed, though speed was certainly valued. Their guest watched these proceedings with evident interest, occasionally approaching the plans to examine particular details. And Watson noticed that the tradesmen, after initial startlement, adapted with remarkable pragmatism to the presence of a being that should not exist, according to conventional understanding. The carpenter, a man named Thomas, who had served in the Navy and apparently developed immunity to surprise, even addressed their guest directly while explaining certain construction choices, speaking slowly and clearly, as one might to someone learning English, though Watson suspected the communication worked through channels that had little to do with verbal language. By midday, the sitting room had been measured and assessed, materials lists had been compiled, and the carpenter had pronounced that preliminary construction could begin immediately in his workshop, with final assembly occurring here in 3 days' time. The metalworker confirmed that custom locks and reinforcements could be ready within the same time frame, and the fabric supplier departed with instructions to deliver materials by evening. Morrison arranged payment for everything with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to expedition logistics, and gradually the bustle subsided, leaving the core group once again in relative quiet. Holmes had been making additional notes throughout the morning, and now he gathered Watson and Morrison for what he termed final considerations. Their guest had settled again near the fire, the wooden carving held loosely, apparently content to rest while humans engaged in whatever incomprehensible activities they deemed necessary. The afternoon light slanted through the windows at angles that would continue steepening until evening, and somewhere in the street below, a barrel organ began playing, its mechanical melody adding unexpected sweetness to the moment. "We depart in 1 week," Holmes announced, his tone brooking no argument, though his expression invited input. That allows time for construction, for accumulation of supplies, for documentation to be prepared, and travel arrangements finalized. Captain Morrison, you will book passage for yourself and Dr. Watson on a steamer departing Liverpool bound for Bombay. I will travel separately with our friend, using the cover of the scientific exhibition we discussed. Different routes, different stories, but converging at predetermined points. Watson felt his pulse quicken. He was to be included, then, in the journey itself. He had not presumed, had waited for Holmes to determine the composition of their party. But the news brought both excitement and trepidation. To travel to the Himalayas, to participate in this extraordinary restoration, meant leaving behind everything familiar for months, venturing into territories that existed at the edge of maps and the limits of European understanding. Yet how could he refuse? How could he remain in comfortable London, knowing that such an adventure beckoned, that his medical skills might prove necessary, that his friend was undertaking something remarkable, and might benefit from companionship? "Holmes," Watson said carefully, "are you certain this division of our party serves us best? Might it not be more prudent for us to travel together, to present a united front, rather than fragmenting our resources?" Holmes smiled, one of those rare expressions of genuine warmth that transformed his usually austere features. "Watson, your presence on the journey is essential, but not primarily for the reasons you might assume. Morrison requires a companion who will both support and, when necessary, restrain him. The guilt he carries could express itself in ways that serve no one. Recklessness born of desire for punishment, or, conversely, paralysis born of shame. You have the temperament to provide balance, to keep him focused on the goal rather than his feelings about the goal. Meanwhile, I will travel with our friend, continuing the process of communication we have begun, attempting to learn more of his language and teach him more of ours, so that when we finally reach his home, we arrive not as silent strangers, but as companions who have shared the journey in both its physical and metaphorical dimensions. The logic was sound, though Watson suspected additional calculations lay behind the plan. Concerns about security, perhaps, or strategic advantages to having their party divided in ways that made them less conspicuous individually while maintaining ability to coordinate. But these were details that could be refined in the days ahead. For now, the essential framework existed. A week to prepare, then departure, toward an end that seemed both impossibly distant and strangely inevitable, as though the entire sequence of events, from discovery in the cellar to this moment of planning, had been ordained by something larger than their individual wills, written in some book of cosmic justice that demanded restoration of what had been displaced, healing of what had been broken, and recognition that kindness transcended the boundaries that convention drew between categories of being. Mountains have a way of making time feel different, stretching hours into something that resembles eternity, while simultaneously compressing weeks into moments. And it was weeks into moments, and it was in this altered temporal state that the journey reached its culmination. The months of travel had passed in a sequence of transformations, steam and rail and road giving way to footpath, and then to no path at all. Simply the ancient knowledge of those who knew these heights, and could read direction in stone and snow, and the angle of light across peaks that touched the sky. Watson's journal, kept faithfully throughout, had filled 3 volumes with observations, both mundane and extraordinary, cataloguing not merely geographical progress, but also the gradual deepening of understanding between species, the way communication had evolved from gesture and tone into something approaching genuine conversation, despite the absence of shared vocabulary. They stood now at an elevation where breathing required conscious effort, where the air held so little substance that each inhalation felt incomplete, unsatisfying. And yet, the view justified whatever discomfort the thin atmosphere imposed. Before them spread a landscape of such austere beauty that Watson found himself understanding why ancient peoples had placed their gods in high places. If divinity existed anywhere, surely it dwelt here among these peaks that had witnessed the birth of continents, that would remain long after humanity's brief tenure concluded, indifferent and eternal, and utterly magnificent in their disregard for the small creatures who scrambled across their slopes, seeking meaning or redemption, or simply the next breath. Their guest had grown increasingly animated as they climbed, recognizing landmarks invisible to European eyes, but clearly meaningful to someone who had known these mountains as home. The travelling enclosure that had served so well throughout the journey had been abandoned 2 days ago, no longer necessary in elevations where human presence was rare enough that concealment became pointless. Now their companion moved freely, occasionally ranging ahead with a confidence that spoke of intimate familiarity, then returning to ensure the humans maintained adequate pace, showing concern for their welfare that touched Watson deeply. The creature worried for them, understood their vulnerability in this environment, took responsibility for their safe passage, despite everything that had transpired. Holmes had developed remarkable facility with the gesture and tone communication that their friend employed, and Watson had watched their exchanges grow increasingly complex as the journey progressed. Now, Holmes could indicate questions about terrain or weather, could express gratitude or concern, could even attempt something approaching humour, though whether the attempts landed as intended remained charmingly uncertain. The boundaries between species, never as fixed as convention suggested, had become permeable through sustained attention and genuine care, proving once again that consciousness recognized itself across whatever forms it inhabited, that kinship was not a matter of biology, but rather of recognition and respect. Morrison had transformed during the journey as well, the guilt that had weighed so heavily gradually giving way to something more constructive, not absolution, which he neither sought nor claimed to deserve, but rather a commitment to using his knowledge and resources in service of restoration rather than extraction. He had spoken at length during the long evenings in camps and way stations about his plans for the future, about advocacy for protection of remote regions from the kind of exploitation he had practiced, about using his platform as explorer and scientist to argue for policies that recognized sovereignty and dignity in all conscious beings, regardless of how they diverged from human norms. The cave system emerged from the mountainside like a mouth opened in stone, its entrance marked by formations that Watson initially took for natural features, but which resolved, upon closer inspection, into deliberate modifications, carved symbols, deliberately placed stones, creating a threshold that separated outside from within, public space from private sanctuary. Their guest stopped at this boundary and made a sound Watson had not heard before, higher pitched and carrying across the thin air with remarkable clarity a call or announcement, or perhaps a request for permission to approach. The response came from within the caves, multiple voices taking up the call, modulating it, creating harmonics that resonated through stone and snow until the entire mountain seemed to sing. Watson felt the hair rise on his arms and neck, not from cold, but from the profound recognition of witnessing something extraordinary, a music that predated human civilization and would continue long after, the sound of beings who had learned to make art from their voices and from the acoustic properties of their high-altitude homes. Then they emerged, first one, then another, then more, until Watson counted 8 distinct individuals, ranging from juvenile to ancient, their white fur catching the thin sunlight in ways that made them seem to glow with inner luminescence. They approached their returned companion with visible emotion, surrounding but not crushing, touching with careful tenderness, making sounds that needed no translation, their meaning carried by tone and touch, and the simple fact of reunion after months of separation and uncertainty. The 3 humans stood apart, giving space to this moment, and Watson found his vision blurring despite the cold that should have frozen any tears before they could form. Morrison's face was wet without shame, and even Holmes, usually so controlled, had to look away, occupying himself with adjustments to his pack that required no actual adjustment. They had succeeded, had returned what had been taken, had crossed continents, and surmounted obstacles, both practical and profound, to reach this moment where their role concluded, and something larger began. Reintegration of an individual into community, healing of wounds that words could barely describe. Eventually, their companion detached from the reunion and returned to the humans, bringing with it one of the elder individuals whose bearing suggested authority or wisdom, or perhaps simply age-earned respect. This elder examined the 3 humans with remarkable thoroughness, those luminous eyes moving across faces and postures with an intelligence that was assessing, judging, determining what manner of beings had participated in the return. Then it did something extraordinary. It reached into a pouch worn at its side and withdrew objects that it placed carefully in the snow between them and the humans. A carved stone, a bundle of dried plants, and a small woven item whose purpose Watson could not immediately determine, but whose craftsmanship was evident. Holmes understood first, his expression shifting to something approaching awe. "Gifts," he murmured, "not payment, but rather acknowledgement. Recognition of service rendered, of harm partially redressed. Watson, Morrison, we are being thanked." Morrison sank to his knees in the snow, heedless of the cold, and when he spoke, his voice carried barely above a whisper, yet seemed to fill the entire space between peaks. "I do not deserve thanks. I deserve judgment, condemnation. What I did." But the elder had raised one massive hand, a gesture that transcended species in its clarity. Enough. What was done could not be undone, but what happened next could be chosen. The past existed, immutable and complete, but the future remained unwritten, and in that space between what had been and what might be lay the possibility of actions that honored dignity and recognized wrong without being paralyzed by it. The gesture said all this and more, and Morrison received it with a nod that might have been acceptance or simply acknowledgement that he had been heard and, impossibly, offered something approaching forgiveness. The afternoon aged toward evening, the light taking on that particular quality, found only at extreme altitude, where atmosphere was too thin to scatter rays in the familiar ways, creating illumination that seemed to come from all directions and none, making the snow glow as though lit from within. Their companion gestured toward the cave system, clearly inviting them to shelter for the night. But Holmes declined with careful courtesy, indicating instead the lower elevations where camps could be made in air that human lungs could process with less strain. Understanding passed between them. The humans would descend in the morning, would begin the long journey back to their own kind, while this being would remain where it belonged, surrounded by family and familiar peaks, and the particular cold that felt like home. The farewell was neither rushed nor prolonged, achieving instead that perfect duration that honoured significance without becoming overwhelming. Their companion approached each human individually, placing one massive hand against each face with extraordinary gentleness, a gesture that conveyed blessing or gratitude or simply connection, the acknowledgement that something had passed between them that transcended the circumstances of meeting, that consciousness had recognized consciousness and found kinship despite all apparent differences. To Morrison, the creature offered something more, a sound that Watson could only interpret as absolution granted, the release of burden that the captain had carried since his first terrible decision, permission to move forward without being forever chained to guilt that served no constructive purpose. Then it turned and walked toward the cave entrance, where its family waited, and just before disappearing into that threshold between outside and within, it paused and looked back. Watson raised his hand in farewell, as did Holmes and Morrison, and the creature mirrored the gesture with that remarkable capacity for learning it had demonstrated throughout, then vanished into the mountain's depths, returning to a life that could finally resume its proper patterns, freed from displacement, restored to context, home. The descent began in silence that felt appropriate, each man processing the conclusion of a journey that had been simultaneously physical and moral, geographical and philosophical. They made camp that evening in a sheltered valley where oxygen allowed normal breathing and exhaustion permitted rest. And as they sat around a small fire, fuel was precious at this elevation. Holmes spoke thoughts that had clearly been forming throughout the day's extraordinary events. "We tend to draw such confident lines," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying easily in the thin air, "between human and animal, between intelligence and instinct, between what deserves rights and what can be used without moral consideration. But those lines are not natural features of the world. They are conveniences we construct to justify our actions, to make ourselves comfortable with hierarchies that serve our interests. What we witness today challenges all such convenient categorizations, suggests that consciousness appears in forms we have barely begun to recognize, let alone respect." Morrison nodded slowly, his face illuminated by firelight in ways that made him look simultaneously younger and older, burnished by exhaustion and something else, something that might have been the beginning of peace. "I shall spend whatever remains of my life arguing for protection of high places," he said, "not merely as scientific curiosities or resources to be exploited, but as sovereign territories where beings we are only beginning to understand live lives we have no right to interrupt. The mountain peoples, and I mean that term to include all conscious inhabitants of such regions, regardless of whether they walk on 2 legs or 4, they deserve to exist undisturbed to continue patterns that were ancient when our civilization was young. Watson looked up at the stars, visible in quantities impossible to observe from London, where gas lamps and coal smoke obscured all but the brightest celestial objects. Here, the Milky Way spread across the sky like spilled cream, each point of light representing distances that defied comfortable comprehension. And he thought about perspective, about how the same event could appear entirely different depending on one's vantage point. From England, this journey might seem like adventure or scientific expedition or peculiar rescue mission. But from here, from these mountains, it was simply the return of one individual to family and home, unremarkable in its essence, however extraordinary in its execution. Both perspectives were valid, both true, and learning to hold multiple truths simultaneously without needing to collapse them into singular narratives. That, Watson thought, might be the real lesson of this entire extraordinary experience. They reached Darjeeling 3 weeks later, thin and weathered, but carrying something more valuable than any artifacts or specimens. Stories that would never be published, knowledge that would never appear in scientific journals, but which would shape how they moved through the world henceforth, informing decisions and colouring perceptions in ways both subtle and profound. Morrison departed for London by a different route, carrying letters of introduction from Holmes to various reformist societies that might benefit from his testimony and advocacy. Holmes and Watson returned by stages, taking time to process all that had occurred, allowing the extraordinary to settle into memory where it could be retrieved and examined during the ordinary days that awaited their return. Baker Street welcomed them with its familiar smells and sounds, Mrs. Hudson expressing relief at their safe return, while simultaneously scolding them for the state of their boots and the alarming reduction in their waistlines. The sitting room remained exactly as they had left it, the fire laid ready for lighting, their chairs positioned as they had always been, the city beyond the windows continuing its eternal patterns of commerce and crime, and the small domestic dramas that gave shape to human existence. It was, Watson reflected, as though the journey had never occurred, as though months of travel and revelation and transformation had been dreamed rather than lived. But on the mantelpiece, carefully displayed, sat 3 objects: a carved stone, dried plants now pressed and mounted, and a small woven item that caught light in ways that seemed impossible for mere fibre and natural dyes. Evidence, if evidence were needed, that the extraordinary was real, that consciousness manifested in forms humanity was only beginning to recognize, and that sometimes, when all forces aligned and good people committed themselves to difficult work, wrongs could be partially redressed, and displaced, beings could find their way home. And now, dear friend, who has journeyed with us through this long night's telling, we reach our story's natural conclusion. If you found comfort in these words, if this tale helped quiet your thoughts and gentle you toward rest, I would be grateful if you might subscribe to this channel. Leave a like to help others find these peaceful stories, and perhaps share in the comments what time you finally surrendered to sleep, or where in this wide world you listened from. Such connections, like the one between Holmes and the being he helped return home, remind us that consciousness recognizes itself across all boundaries, that kindness costs nothing but gives everything, and that we are all, in our different ways, seeking the same fundamental things: safety, understanding, and the knowledge that we belong somewhere, to someone, in this vast and mysterious universe that holds more wonders than we can possibly imagine. Sleep well, rest deeply, and may your dreams carry you to high places where the air is thin and clear and stars shine with impossible brightness, where beings we barely understand live lives of dignity and purpose, and where every lost thing eventually finds its way home. Good night.